The news out of Minnesota recently was just absolutely shocking. The shooting incident on June 14th, it led to the tragic deaths of Democratic Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband, and also the attempted murder of Senator John Hoffman and his wife. The accused, Vance Boelter, well, he was captured after this really intense 36-hour manhunt.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this a bit. Our mission here, really, in this deep dive, is to understand the why. Why would something like this happen? We're going to explore how experts, the ones who track extremist groups, are starting to piece together the radical religious and political influences they think likely motivated these shootings, and we're drawing directly from some detailed sources you shared.
That's right. The sources we're looking at are mainly comprehensive reports from Baptist Global News and New York Magazine. And our goal really is just to sift through all these layers of information, try to grasp the complex ideological landscape that experts are suggesting might have influenced Boelter. We want to give you a nuanced understanding, but of course, without endorsing any specific viewpoint from the original material itself. Okay, so let's start with Vance Boelter, the accused. He was 57. A childhood friend described him, interestingly, as someone prone to fantasy, like playing army men, but never actually enlisted. Found Jesus as a teenager. Professionally, was kind of varied, managed a 7-Eleven, also picked up bodies for local funeral homes. And this same friend mentioned his political leanings like Donald Trump, Infowars, and apparently fervently hated abortion.
Mm-hmm.
Boelter had even founded a ministry and a private security company with his wife, though NPR found the security company seemed, pretty much defunct. No clients, no employees, which does make you wonder.
It does. And the early picture emerging, from podcasts, social media, his own writings, it's one of a really strident anti-abortionist and a Christian nationalist. What's really fascinating, I think, is that experts are suggesting he was more or less indoctrinated by dominionist thinking.
Dominionist.
Yeah.
That's the idea that Christians should control all parts of society, right?
Exactly. That and also latter-rain theologies, and possibly influenced by the new Apostolic Reformation network as well.
And beyond his local stuff, Boelter sometimes traveled, right, to the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Yeah, he did, pursuing business projects, but also preaching in a local church there. And some online videos of those sermons actually resurfaced after the incident, showed him preaching against LGBTQ plus rights, things like that.
But the really chilling part, the direct evidence.
Yeah.
Police found that manifesto and hit list in his car. It identified abortion rights supporters, pro-choice activists, other Democratic lawmakers, specific targets.
Yeah. And his rhetoric, his alleged acts, unfortunately, it makes him a sort of a familiar character in the landscape of domestic terrorism. The sources point out, and it's often the case, that the far right is usually responsible for acts like these, and religion often serves as a key motivating factor. They draw parallels to figures like Eric Rudolph, who also specifically targeted abortion clinics.
That brings us right to those theological influences experts think were shaping his thinking, especially this new Apostolic Reformation, or NER. Matthew Taylor, he's a senior scholar at the Institute for Christian, Jewish, and Islamist Studies, wrote a book, The Violent Take It by Force, really digging into NER. He explains NER as this network. It's loosely affiliated, but actually highly organized. Self-proclaimed apostles, prophets, convinced God gave them authority to rebuild the church and, by extension, the nation. And we know from other reporting that leaders from this movement were involved in January 6th.
Right.
Taylor specifically said Boelter dipped into the world that surrounds the new Apostolic Reformation. He'd spent some time in charismatic leadership circles.
Those are the movements emphasizing direct experience with God, spiritual gifts, prophecy, healing, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And that he had some ties in that world, which Taylor believes seems to have played some role in his radicalization.
Mm-hmm. And if you look closely at Boelter's preaching, particularly the sermons from Africa, it really indicated adherence to latter-rain theology. That's the belief that Christians will actually control both church and government before Christ's second coming. He specifically talked about the American church in those sermons from Congo, said it needs to be renewed, it's out of line, and so God's going to send apostles and prophets to renew and bring it back into line to correct it. And this, I think, raises a really crucial question for us and for you listening. How does a belief system like that actually translate into real-world action, into someone feeling they have the authority to act?
It's a critical point, and it seems to lead directly to what was clearly central for Boelter.
Yeah.
This intense anti-abortion stance. He was described as a highly charged pro-life proponent, and Taylor noted the whole independent charismatic media space is just, quote, filled to the brim with very, very extreme rhetoric around abortion.
Yeah, and some of the most extreme interpretations you find in these circles frame abortion as a form of child sacrifice to demons controlling the United States.
Hmm.
Now, if that's your deeply held belief, your position, then, well, there's just no room for debate, is there? No compromising, no negotiating.
Right. It completely changes the nature of the disagreement.
Exactly. It transforms it from a political or moral issue into, in their view, a pagan practice that is throwing demons over America. And that has profoundly dangerous implications for behavior. Taylor said it's hard to pin down exactly where Boelter got these specific ideas, but he was definitely swimming in the waters where those ideas are present.
So, to understand even more, experts looked into his education. Boelter attended Christ for the Nations Institute, CFNI, in Dallas. It's described as this multi-denominational, spirit-filled Bible college, charismatic, evangelical, Pentecostal lineage.
And there's a really crucial detail from CFNI, shared by Jeff Charlotte. He's an expert on American fascism, a professor at Dartmouth. Charlotte shared this photo he took inside the Institute's lobby just this year, 2024. And it featured this text, quite striking. Everyone ought to pray at least one violent prayer each day.
Wow. Violent prayer. What did that mean?
Well, according to Charlotte, a student there explained it, said this violent prayer was necessary to remind yourself every day that the culture, basically, the rest of us, the unsaved, are the enemy. And the student clarified, apparently, not you in particular, he said, just, the culture. It's a stark illustration, isn't it, how a concept like prayer can be framed to create this intense us versus them dynamic.
And Charlotte also pointed out a historical connection for CFNI that's, well, pretty disturbing. It was founded back in 1970 by Gordon Lindsay, a Pentecostal revivalist. But Lindsay had previously been involved with the white supremacist Christian identity ideology.
That's a significant link. And Lindsay's understanding of spiritual war, according to Charlotte, was seen as a kind of physicalized reality, something Boelter clearly preached and seemed to follow. Metaphors don't just reflect reality, they actively shape it. And like actual war, this idea of spiritual war presupposes an enemy that's seen as so dangerous, so unreasonable, that violence becomes, well, the only logical response in that worldview.
Yeah.
This is where it gets really concerning, I think, how rhetorical violence can kind of morph into a perceived literal justification for taking action.
Yeah, and it's important, I think, to add some context here about spiritual warfare. Millions of Christians believe in it. And for the vast majority, prayer is where it ends. The concept itself isn't unique to Denier or charismatic circles. You find it in many evangelical congregations. Think of Ephesians 6.12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, and so on.
That's true. It's a widespread concept. But while it absolutely doesn't lead to violence for most believers, the belief system can be, as the sources note, apocalyptic in character and profoundly conspiratorial. Why? Because it adds this demonic dimension to everyday worldly tensions. Think about Frank Peretti's novel, This Present Darkness. Hugely popular. It depicts angels and demons literally battling for a small town through human proxies, including, significantly, a liberal professor working for Satan.
Right, I remember that book. It framed cultural and political divides as literal spiritual battles.
Exactly. And scholar Julie Ingersoll warned about this a rise in violent rhetoric and, worryingly, an increasing number of Americans willing to engage in violence against fellow citizens in the name of an apocalyptic alternate reality. As she snarkily put it, a gun is more tangible than an angel.
That's a sobering thought. And you can see how, for people with authoritarian leanings, this idea of spiritual warfare could be incredibly useful. Political opponents aren't just misguided people you disagree with. No, they get framed as actual agents of the devil. Their very humanity becomes questionable.
And that framing, according to the experts analyzing Boelter, is key. His specific interpretation of Christianity, they argue, did not force him to kill, but it did give him permission to act. And while he's accused of carrying out this assassination campaign seemingly by himself, in a broader ideological sense, he's not alone. There are others in that space.
It makes you think back. Remember that image before the Obergefell Supreme Court decision? The man blowing a shofar, a ram's horn, outside the court. The meaning of the shofar in the book of Joshua is pretty intense. The Israelites sound them, the walls in Jericho fall, and then they kill nearly everyone they find.
Right. And that raises a really critical question the sources touch on. What happens when someone invested in that kind of narrative feels their side loses a battle? The average crank, as one source puts it, might just blow his horn or vote or donate money maybe to groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom. But sometimes, There's a man like Boelter who decides that prayer is insufficient and that voting is no good as long as liberals can still do it. Understanding that pathway from belief to perceived insufficient nonviolent action to violence, that's crucial.
And then there's that chilling text message Boelter reportedly sent his family after the shooting. CNN reported it. He wrote, "Dad went to war last night. It's like he'd stopped playing army men. Now he's in it for real," as one report put it. Just awful. It's also worth noting, just impartially reporting here, the political reactions that followed immediately. The spread of conspiracy theories, the blame game. You had Mike Cernovich claiming Minnesota Governor Tim Walz was somehow involved. Senator Mike Lee saying, "This is what happens when Marxists don't get their way." Elon Musk posting, "The far left is murderously violent."
Yeah, and there was immediate pushback against those claims, of course. Neera Tanden, for example, kind of mocked Musk by pointing to Boelter's alleged target list abortion clinics, pro-choice figures, clearly not far-left targets. And maybe most telling, Boelter's own roommate, David Carlson, told reporters point-blank that Boelter definitely was not a liberal and would actually be offended by that label. It just underscores the danger, really, of jumping to partisan conclusions immediately.
And looking ahead, Matthew Taylor, the NIR expert we mentioned, offers a really sobering prediction. He warns that we are seeing this rise in political violence that is deeply, deeply concerning and yet somehow very, very predictable. As the boiling point in our society keeps everything at this high boil of intensity and rage and aggression and incitement. He concludes really grimly, we are on a knife's edge, and it's a situation where incidents like these are going to happen. So after digging into all this, what does it all mean for us? We've seen how one individual's alleged horrific actions can be deeply tangled up with specific extreme theological interpretations, political ideologies, and how a belief in something like spiritual warfare can, for some, warp from metaphor into what they see as a physical reality, motivating violence.
It leaves you with a difficult question, doesn't it? Especially thinking about Boelter's text message, "Dad went to war last night," and those expert warnings about being on a knife's edge. What responsibility do we all have, as individuals, as a society, to recognize and maybe even address the kind of rhetoric that can give people that perceived permission to act in such dangerous ways long before the violence actually erupts?